Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am delighted. I've been waiting for this podcast for a very long time because it is one of the rare occasions when I am interviewing a podcast host himself who I've consumed nearly every single episode of. Today we are speaking with Paul from Ask About Wealth. Paul, I've done a separate introduction. People will be familiar with you from the bonus episode I shared when I was on your show. Yeah. I've put across the book on my Instagram stories. I'm coming through the course at the minute. I'm going to be booking in for a consult.
I'll give you the $5 later.
You've made me a lot more back than a $5, so I think it's money well spent. But for those that are listening, instead of going too much into the backstory, which we will as we go through, I want to quote back one of your lines, and we'll use that as a jumping off point.
Sure.
Ireland is a country that is a tax haven for companies, but a tax nightmare for individuals. Will you talk a little bit about that, and then that will give us the catalyst and the jumping off point for everything else we're going to discuss in this podcast?
Sure. I suppose the first thing to say there is, what I mean by that is Ireland is very famously a tax haven for companies with a 12.5% broad tax rate. I remember reading, one of the big tech companies on average paying 2% a year tax here with all the write-offs they have. And of course, that has to be welcomed because it has contributed to the prosperity of Ireland. We have, something like 100,000 people in big tech working away, earning lots of money. And those big tech companies are here because of the tax breaks. And I have no problem with that. And in fact, as you well know, I'm fond of tax breaks. But what I meant when I said that was the same isn't true for those people working for those companies, or indeed any other people working in Ireland. We've got a system where at the very top end, which you get to beyond 44,000 a year, you have potential to pay 40% tax, 4% PRSI, 8% USC. That means 52% of everything you're earning above those bands is disappearing before you've got it. And not only that, but then you take home the 48% and you pay 60-odd% excise duties on your petrol or diesel. You pay the same on your vodka or whiskey. You pay certain amounts on cigarettes or wine or whatever it is. So if you actually looked at the income of high earners in Ireland, and you were able to, and it's not an easy thing to do, but if you were able to say, there's the tax they pay as they earn it, and there's the tax they pay as they spend it. My view is that at least 70%, if not 80% of the income we're earning is actually given to the state in one way or another. Now, if we had an 80% tax rate for our companies, we wouldn't have any of those big techs or big pharma companies in Ireland. But the problem for the Irish taxpayers, of course, is they can't escape. They are Irish, they're living here, they're working here, they're raising a family here. So unlike the big corporations, which can up sticks and move on, if they were asked to pay the same taxes we were asked to pay, we as a population don't have that ability. Now, I suppose it's worth adding to that Ireland is also a place where there are substantial tax breaks for those high-earning individuals, for all individuals in fairness, but that can be used to reduce that percentage, as long as you know what they are, as long as you have the stomach for whatever risk they do or do not represent, and as long as you get good quality financial planning advice. And unfortunately, the last bit there is rare in this country, in my view.
We will unpack that as we go through, because something I gathered from your content, which was a very illuminating and highlighting for me, was the role financial advisors play versus financial planners versus accountants, and the obligatory and compulsory things they have to divulge and give versus who should be saving you money and who is keeping you out of jail. So we will double back on that.
Okay.
But you mentioned the tax breaks. What would be one or two of the most common ones that people tend to not take advantage of or even know about when it comes to the average person in Ireland?
Well, by far the most common one is the retirement vehicle. by a long way. And if you think about this from a saver's point of view, a retirement fund is fully taxed. So any contribution you pay within the limits, and there are limits, but they're generous limits more often than not. Let's say you pay €100 into a retirement fund. If you're a top rate taxpayer, that €100 costs you €60. Now, I've often say to people, and I've said on my own podcasts, if I racked up to your front door and offered to sell you £100 for 60 quid, you'd bite me bloody arm off to get it. But that's what a retirement fund is. That's what it allows you to do. That's effectively a 66% return in a day. So what other investment can offer you a 66% return in a day? Very few, if any. So the retirement fund is overlooked in many cases because people say, well, I have a pension. And, about half of the working population can say that. And when auto-enrollment, does its job, maybe about 80% of people can say that. I have a pension. But having a pension and maximising a pension are two completely different things.
How do we go about maximising it? Is this obviously financial literacy and your content and going through it? But for someone listening that's like, well, I'm paying a pension, and then their mind is completely closed off, and now you've just said optimising the pension and their mind is just opened again.
Yeah.
What would be the 0 to 1 on that?
I was talking to somebody in one of the big tech companies last week. And the company is a very generous pension scheme. It has what they call 6% matching. So the gentleman I was talking to is paying 6% of his salary into it, and the company is paying 6% matching. Now, that's a good deal, but the gentleman in question had a 25% allowance. So even though the company wouldn't match the extra 19%, it wasn't even on his radar screen because, as I said, his attitude is, I have a pension.
And when you say allowance, you can put it in there tax-free?
Yeah. There's no limit to how much you can put into a pension, but there is a limit for tax relief purposes, and that limit grows depending on your age. It depends on how much use you've made of it in the past and so on. But I suppose if you think about that individual having an engagement with the person who sells that pension in that organisation, they're there to get his 6%. They're not there, to talk to him about long-term planning. They're not there to talk to him or her about, what is the best way of investing money. They're there to represent the broker and insurance company and the employer. So, as I say, a lot of those people are missing the extra, in that case, 19%. And in, at 6% payment, the maximum extra is 34%. So if you're older, the allowance moves up to 34% of salary. Now, the other thing to say is that often these percentages they relate to base salary only. So a lot of people in a lot of jobs out there listening to us today have a base salary plus a bonus system plus a car allowance plus, whatever it might be. And they're missing the trick because they're applying the 6% to the base salary, not the total income. My own father was with Cadbury's, and all the way through his career at Cadbury's, he met with pensions people, and he was told he was going to get 50% of income or salary as his pension fund. And he retired slightly early, but he ended up getting 50% of his base salary, which was 25% of his gross income, because my dad was sales manager and half his income was based on performance. So, as he often said to me, I wish I'd met you when I was 40 years of age, Paul. And I said, you did, Dad, I was too. And, you know what I mean. Again, a trick is missed because, as I say, oftentimes the individual having that discussion is there to tick a box, is there to get your 6% and match your 6% and go off and go back to the office and celebrate another sale.
One of the biggest things I got from you, and you've given me a beautiful tie into that, was the difference between financial advisors and financial planners. I'm into finance. I'm into wealth accumulation. This is an area that's been of personal interest for me for the last decade or so, since I kind of moved into that high income earner bracket. But until I came across your content, I had these all muddled up together. So I think this isn't quite a focus group of one question, because there's going to be a lot of people listening who are the exact same. Can you explain the difference between a financial advisor and a financial planner, and then possibly even an accountant? Because some people confuse people who manage or help with money, and they put them all into one bracket when they're completely different things.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first question, I mean, let's look to the legislation to define a financial advisor. Because a financial advisor is defined in Irish law as someone licensed to sell regulated financial product. So a financial advisor is defined in law as a salesperson. You know, as I often say to people, we don't call the fellow who sells us a car an automotive advisor. You know, he is a car salesman, or she is a car salesperson, or salesgirl, or saleswoman, or whatever the accurate description might be. So, but we do call people who flog us financial product financial advisors. And it's, as I say, it's enshrined in the law of the land. So, so that's a financial advisor. Broadly speaking, somebody paid to sell you a range of pre-packaged products. Pre-packaged products would contain already in their terms and conditions the profit of the institution that's built them, that contain the profit of the salesman that's selling them to you, putting your profit necessarily in that example in no better than third place. There's a very old joke in the business about a young man joining a fund management company on the day of the company barbecue. And he's out in Hoth Yacht Club, and he's standing on the deck, and he finds himself talking to the chairman. And the chairman has a cognac in one hand and a Cuban in the other, and is looking out over the yachts. And he says, "Welcome to the company, young man." He says, "Just look out there. See that yacht there? That's my yacht. And see that yacht there? That's the financial director's yacht. And see that? Well, that's the sales director." And the naive young man, he says, "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, where are all the clients' yachts?" The clients don't have yachts because they're not the ones making all the money.
Yeah.
So we've got a system that purports. I have no problem, by the way, with somebody selling. I have no problem with the car salesman. You know, I know what you are. I walk into a Volkswagen garage. I expect to be sold a Volkswagen. I don't expect you to sell me a BMW or a Range Rover or whatever, whatever car might be best for me. I expect you to sell me the car best for me in your suite of products available. So again, I have no problem with that. The problem I have is if he calls himself an automotive advisor, but behind the scenes is just selling me a Volkswagen. That's my problem. And I think that's the problem here, is that, you can be handed a business card that says independent financial advisor on it. And if you use the Oxford English Dictionary definition of independent financial advisor, you look up those three words, you will get, somebody who's impartial, somebody who works for you. But that's not what independent financial advisor means in Ireland. How does a financial planner differ? Well, first of all, there's no particular, role in the world of finance that is financial planner. It's kind of what I call an impartial financial advisor, because if you can be impartial, if you can avoid the need to sell a product to get paid, then you can be impartial. It's impossible to be impartial if you're getting paid by the institution that's manufactured the product. If you're not, and it's worth saying, every financial product out there that's for sale that has a commission attaching to it is available without commission attaching to it. You just have to find the advisor that's willing to give it to you and willing to sit down with you and say, I'm going to add value to you. This is the value I'm going to add, and this is the fee I'm going to charge you to add it. And then you have a fairly simple value for money decision to make, don't you? If I charge you X and I save you 10X, then that's a good deal. And so that's broadly the difference. Financial planners, for the most part, can deliver exactly the same product range and a few more, which we might get onto, which fall outside the commission range altogether. But they can deliver the exact same product range, but they can deliver it at their choice without the usual commissions, without that profit of the institution and their own profit already enshrined in the terms and conditions.
I think that's so important for people to understand. And my kind of red flag, yellow flag started to go off because there's no such thing as a free lunch in finance. And I remember the first time I sat down with a financial advisor, and I've met several, worked with several, so it's not new to me. But I was asking, I was like, what's your fee? I was like, how much do I pay you for this hour consultation? They were like, oh, there's no fee.
Yeah.
It's like once you sign up and you get on to Zurich or Aviva or whoever it was, that's how I get paid. And I was like, okay. And I was like, as someone that runs a business, I run a company, I was like, that didn't sit right with me in terms of something wasn't quite connecting. And it's not to play down or disregard the role. It's just understanding what you're actually getting, like the car salesman example.
Exactly. And give another way of putting it. If you don't pay for your financial advice, then either you're getting it from a charitable institution or somebody else is paying. Now, I don't know of any financial advisory firm operating in the philanthropic area, so I don't know of any charity that's doing it. So it means that if you're not paying for it, somebody else is paying for it. And the old saying of he who pays the piper calls the tune applies in my world as it does in your world, Brian, as it does in every other business world that I'm aware of. So that's the difference between a financial advisor and a financial planner. Financial planner is paid by you to help achieve the goals you wish to achieve, financially short, medium, longer term goals. A financial advisor is paid by the institutions to flog you stuff.
I'm going to give a hard pitch for your book here because that, and the course is fantastic as well. It's kind of like the book on steroids, so it goes through it in more detail. But in the Tricks of the Rich book, for people that are listening, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast, I'll have Ireland in the title, so there's a good chance it's going to be Irish people specifically listening to this. The Tricks of the Rich book goes into everything we're talking about in this podcast, but in a little bit more detail, and then talks about the course and why you potentially might move on to it in terms of if you get the knowledge. For me, it was I want to go deeper. The course was the obvious thing, and then the consult is next, obviously, for me in terms of my process. But the book is brilliant for Irish people. It's kind of like I've used Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is a book, one of the original financial books I read in 2012.
Excellent book.
Very, very good book, but very applicable to the US market.
Yeah.
What I found, and I have recommended your book to business clients, people that I know that are friends that are running companies. I'm like, this is your Rich Dad, Poor Dad for the Irish market. This is going through what you need to know as an Irish business owner, and also if you're an employee, because it goes through a lot that people need to understand. So I'm going to give a hard right hook for that.
Thank you.
And then it builds on to something that is in the book and on the course, and that's the golden rules of wealth accumulation.
Yeah.
I'll run through the 4, and then I'm going to talk about the biggest impediment.
Before you do that, can I just say about the book, give you a bit of history? I mean, you mentioned Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I wrote my book after reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It was the incentive for me to write it, because as much as I loved that book and the anecdotal nature of it, and the good juxtaposition for his rich dad and his poor dad, as it were, what I found having read it was as much as I enjoyed it, most of the tips that it spoke about weren't relevant to Ireland. He talked about mortgages, and he talked about, for most mortgages in America, for example, are on what is called a non-recourse basis. So that means that if you borrow money to buy a property in America and the market goes kaboom like it did in 2008 to 2011, you just hand back the keys and you walk away. That isn't here. You hand back the keys, they sell the property for half what you owe, and they come after you for the other half, and they come after you for the rest of your life. And if you're unlucky enough to drop dead before they get you, they'll come after your kids. So that's so it struck me that as interesting as that book was, and entertaining certainly as it was, it had virtually the core message, which was build property and do it with other people's money. It just didn't work here in the event that there was a problem. So I wrote the original version of Tricks of the Rich in 2006, 2 years before 2008. So, and I'm not pretending in any way to be a clairvoyant, because I'm not, but, that was my view, that it was a good book, but there was no real application in Ireland of the tips that it gave. So I wanted to do a book that gave an Irish perspective to that, and, the rules of wealth and all of these other great books I'd read, predominantly produced in the United States of America, where the rules of wealth are very different than the rules in Ireland.
Let's talk about the rules of wealth in Ireland and wealth accumulation then, because the 4 golden rules: leverage other people's money, invest before tax, keep more of what you earn, pension, dividends versus salary. They're very wide in terms of, you could pick one and we could do a whole podcast potentially on each one. But instead of going through that, because they do build upon one another as well, for those that are listening that are either high earners or moderate earners, they're employees, they're running businesses. I know it's different. If you run a company, you can invest in executive pension plans, etc., and different retirement plans. What do you see with all the calls that you do with people and social media? Your channels are how I came across you first was actually Instagram, and then the podcast. And I'm an audio person. I like going deep on topics. So the podcast was a huge draw for me. What do you see as generally the biggest impediment to wealth accumulation for people in Ireland? Is it their spending habits? Is it not being able to get out of debt? Is it not investing correctly in their retirement? Is it a combination of several things? What do you see most often, Paul?
Knowledge. I mean, I say to people, people ask me often, ask about wealth trying to do. And at its core, what we're trying to do is give people new knowledge and new information so they can better instruct, question, and challenge their financial advisors. Because we don't do any of that. Predominantly, we meet our financial advisors, and let's use that collective term, as you said, for accountants and financial advisors and lawyers and all of that, who are involved in our business activities or our wealth accumulation activities. We meet them, we shrug our shoulders, we go, I know nothing about that sort of thing, whatever you think yourself. And that would be a fantastic system if their agenda was our agenda. But it's not. The accountant's agenda, as you said earlier, is to help you pay tax and keep you out of prison. The financial planners or advisor's agenda, for a Freudian slip there, the financial advisor's agenda is to sell you a range of prepackaged products. The lawyer's agenda is to listen to what your instructions are and do what you tell them to do. None of them are our agenda. So you cannot, if you abdicate responsibility for your money and your wealth creation decisions to people who have different agendas to you, then you don't get to the end game, the end result that you're after. That's just common sense, isn't it? So that's what people lack. And that's where Ask About Wealth came from. I wrote, as I said, the first version of Tricks of the Rich written in 2006. I wrote it on the dart going to work every day. So I had 30 minutes going in, 30 minutes coming out, and I wrote it about 6 months doing that. When that book launched, I'm glad to say it was an Irish bestseller. All that meant, by the way, at that time certainly was that you'd sold 5,000 retail copies or more. I sold 17,000 retail copies. So 6 months of work, I reached 17,000 people. Now, today, I can do a day's of work and I can reach 200,000 people. So it was almost a natural thing for me to go from writing the book to doing the social media stuff, because all I'm trying to do is educate, give people that new knowledge and new information. So instead of going into your accountant and saying, I know nothing about that sort of thing, whatever you think yourself, you're going in and saying, I want an executive pension scheme. I want to claim subsistence allowances. I want to add my wife as a shareholder because she's already working in the business anyway, blah, blah, blah. So that's what I think, to answer your question, what is lacking. And if I can quote, and I'm sure you will remember this from the book, but I put this in the book. One of my eureka moments around financial education was when I met a guy many years ago, and he knows who he is. So if he's listening to this, he'll know who I'm talking about. And he was what is called a prostodontist. And a prostodontist is the most qualified dentist, the highest qualification in dentistry, I believe, that it's possible to have. And he said to me the day I met him, Paul, I had 22 years of formal education. I didn't have 1 hour to teach me about money. Now, what the hell is going on? Since his education, we've added economics perhaps to the curriculum. We've added accountancy. So we've added, a couple of things. Accountancy, basically how to count other people's money, and and how to tax it. Economics to understand the way the world of economics. The economics 101, supply and demand. That sort of stuff. But we're still not learning about adding our wife to the shareholding, or stripping out capital through an executive pension fund, and understanding that doesn't devalue your company, because when I come along to buy your company, I'll add back to the bottom line what you were getting paid, because I'm not buying you, I'm buying your company. So your salary and your pension contribution and your other bonuses don't make a damn worth of difference to the value of your business. And yet people think they do, because they think my business's value is a multiple of profit. And at times, a business's value is a multiple of profit, but not every time. So does that answer your question?
It does. And we're going to do a separate premium podcast for the business coaching in the circle, which will go through this in more about investing in pension funds, save tax, financial freedom as a business owner, etc. But I'm going to talk back for the average person in Ireland here, because sometimes money is a very peculiar topic. Money and sex are kind of the two things that people have.
And religion.
Yes, they're the don't talk about them at the dinner table. No. Keep them quiet, keep them close to the chest, etc. And opening up the conversation around money, there's two lines, and I'm going to talk first about tax avoidance versus tax evasion, and then I'm going to go into one of your favorite quotes, or one of my favorite quotes of yours, which is manipulating your world for the exemptions to apply. And that is very much around things like inheritance tax in Ireland, etc. But you have got several lines about tax, and that, death and taxes, and that you have the right to pay tax, but no more than is necessary, and variations and paraphrasings of that sentence. Talk a little bit about tax avoidance and tax evasion, because from my experience, and again, I might be very biased here, you have way more knowledge, experience talking to people about finances and money than I have. But in my everyday world, working with business owners, people who are running fitness business, health businesses, etc., there's this nearly fear around tax. Like, don't prod the bear. Don't bring it up, like, as opposed to, right, how do I actually maximize this? How do I pay as much as I have to, but no more? Talk to us a little bit about the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion, because when I say tax avoidance to someone, they go, like their stomach jumps into their mouth. I'm like, no, I'm not talking about tax evasion. I'm talking about tax avoidance. Can you explain the difference between the two?
I can. And before I do, just to allay those fears, as you said, of poking the bear, the statistics I've quoted on our podcast come from revenue itself. Revenue reported, the last time they reported to the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, the revenue itself said Irish taxpayers routinely fail to claim €400 million in tax relief they are due. So The revenue isn't setting out to, it won't help you, by the way, it won't help you claim the tax reliefs, but it won't stand in your way if you do. So, and as I say, they regularly report the overpayment of taxation, which is, 400 million is massive, isn't it? I mean, if we all had 400 million a year more, we'd all be much better off. So, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is there is a legal difference, as you're alluding to, between what is called tax evasion and tax avoidance. And the way I describe it is, the difference is 6 feet. And what I mean by that is the width of a prison wall. Evasion is illegal. Evasion is understanding you have a liability and refusing to or attempting to not pay that liability. Avoidance is using the law of the land to pay only the taxes you must pay. And kind of my journey on that kind of, in terms of financial planning, recognizing that I read an article on a flight one time that was in a Portuguese financial magazine. I don't read Portuguese. It was translated into English on one side. But basically it was headed, you have a legal right to pay only the taxes you must pay, but only you can exercise that right. So tax avoidance is about using the law of the land. First of all, understanding, going back to the knowledge piece, knowing what the allowances are, knowing what is legal and what is illegal, and then applying the legal to your circumstances as much as is possible. So, and the other thing to say is that can only be productive if it's done in advance. There is nothing, I'm not a magician. I can't change yesterday. So if somebody, gets on my podcast or my consults and says, I have a bill from, last year of 100 grand, what can I do? Pay it is the answer. There's nothing you can do. That's the past. You can't change the past. What you can, however, is change the future. And the future is quite easy to change relatively to speaking to the past, which is impossible. I would say to people, walk out your front door, turn left or right. That'll change your future. If you go left, you'll see one person. If you go right, you'll see another person. Try turning left or right yesterday. Not possible. So future is much easier to change than the past. And the secret to tax minimization, avoidance may be the tool we use to achieve tax, but the goal is tax minimization. The secret to that is about looking forward, saying what's likely to happen in the future in my financial world, and what, if anything, can I change now that will de-tax those events. So I mentioned a few minutes ago giving shares to your spouse, for example, who's working in the same business, your family business with you. The reason for that is exactly this. You're looking forward. There's 2 major reliefs for business owners when they exit business. One's called entrepreneurial relief, the other is called retirement relief. And potentially between the two of them, they can save somewhere around 400 to 500,000 in tax. And they're individual allowances. So they can save that for you and your spouse if you both qualify. So the qualification is about share ownership, is about time holding those shares, is about salary payments through that period of time. So more often than not, Irish companies are 99% shareholded by one person and 1% shareholding, if the spouse has any, by the spouse. Be that, whichever gender is the one who established, ends up with the 99%. But that in alone doesn't give them maximum access. So you change it. You give the spouse who has 1% 49%. And now you have 2 bites at the entrepreneurial cherry, relief cherry. You have 2 bites at the retirement relief cherry. And in that example, you potentially, and I'm skiing downhill here, Brian, I'm talking about the maximum benefits possible, but potentially can put 500,000 in your pocket that would have disappeared in tax if you didn't do it.
There's so many. When I think about the realizations from the conversations we've had privately before I was on your podcast, reading the book, coming through the course. There's so many aha moments for not about how much money you make, it's about how much money you keep.
Mm-hmm.
And that's your tax minimization. Keeping in theme with the I can change the future but can't change the past, manipulating your world for the exemptions to apply.
Yeah.
Let's use inheritance tax as the example for this, because if I'm not mistaken, and I might be misquoting, so feel free to requote me, the inheritance tax was designed about 50 years ago in Ireland and hasn't really been changed since. I heard this from your podcast. It's also in the course. Talk to us a little bit about inheritance tax, because at some point, unfortunately,
we're all going to die.
We're all going to die. Death is inevitable. It's going to impact everybody here, whether you're a father, son, mother, daughter, grandparent. It impacts everybody across the board. Talk to us a little bit about inheritance tax and legally avoiding it in Ireland.
Okay. Let me start.
Minimizing it is a better
minimizing
word.
Minimizing it. Yeah. Let's start by, you've heard me say it before. I think inheritance tax is the least fair tax on the statute books today. And I think that because it is a tax on already taxed assets. So if your mum or dad, if you're the beneficiary and your mum or dad have managed to accumulate a certain amount of wealth that will ultimately be inherited by you, you have to recognise that mum and dad paid a huge amount of bloody tax as they accumulated these assets. And then you're asked to pay a huge amount of tax again on the assets as they are passed from one generation. So that's why I think it's unfair. And as you say, introduced in the mid-70s, I think, around 50 years ago. And it's not only was unfair then, but it's become more unfair because the tax-free thresholds, the limits that allow us to give our children certain amounts tax-free, haven't risen in line with inflation. So if you look at an estate 50 years ago versus an estate today, with the value of the estate increased with inflation, let's say. Today, more of that estate is exposed to inheritance tax than it was 50 years ago. So it's not only unfair and that's a personal view. I mean, people can agree or disagree with me on that, but it's become more unfair because as the time has gone by, it hasn't kept pace with inflation. So it's to be, if you can minimize it. There are, now again, like I said about the tax of individuals in Ireland, there are quite a number of tax exemptions here. And those, some of the most obvious ones are agricultural relief, business assets relief, there's a thing called dwelling house relief. There's a whole bunch of reliefs. But like any exemption in Ireland, and indeed anywhere in the world that I'm aware of anecdotally, there's a set of qualifying criteria. So the standard will in Ireland, by the way, and only 27, according to the King's Inn, only 27% of Irish adults have a will, which is madness. I think it's because we're superstitious. I think it's because we think if we write a will, we'll die. Right? Now, I don't believe I have that type of influence on the universe, and I don't believe you do either. So write a bloody will. And we might say why in a minute. But in terms of, dying, most people are not only failing to plan, they're failing to have even the basics of a plan, which is write down what you want. So, but looking at these reliefs, let's take dwelling house relief as an example. And it's a good example for me because I was actually talking to a consult about this yesterday. And I was talking to a lady who in 2006 lost her husband the year before, I think, and swapped houses with her daughter. So she's living in her daughter's house and her daughter is living in her house. But the ownership has remained the same. And that's suited because the daughter has a big family and the mum is now alone and all that. And she said to me, will we qualify for dwelling house relief? And the answer was no. Because the qualifying criteria for dwelling house relief is that it must be the principal private residence of the donor the recipient must have lived in it for 3 years before the donation, and they must keep it. They must not have an interest in another property.
Residential, isn't it?
Yes,
Not
residential.
commercial.
Yeah, they can have as much commercial as they want.
Mm.
And they must keep it for 6 years to maintain the relief. So back in 2006, they were going, what seemed like a good idea now robbed them, because the recipient, this lady's daughter in this case, already had an interest in another property, which Mammy was living in. And Mammy had moved her principal private residence out of the house she let the daughter live in. So they didn't qualify on either of the two major. So that gives you a kind of working example, if you like, of it's easy to say dwelling house relief. It's easy for anybody who has Google in front of them to go, dwelling house relief. Maybe we'll get that. But the nuances is, as much as that on the face of it looked like it should be, it wasn't. So, as I said to her, it was an illustration of one of the biggest problems in terms of financial planning that I see is, and I call it the ripple effect, that this was done in 2006, this was done for very good reasons. It made complete sense. But it didn't make tax planning sense. Mm. But nobody even considered it. Because we're taking financial advice, not over whether it's biased or not in terms of product selling, but we're taking it in silos. So we're meeting our accountant and our pensions bloke and our lawyer and our whatever it is, but we never meet them all at the one time. They're not a team. They are a team. You've heard me say before, Brian, financial planning is a team sport. But who's the captain of the team? Who's the one making sure that all of the team are playing to the needs of the owner? Sorry, these are...
got headphones.
Yeah, my
we're in
headphones are
Prymal
slipping.
Studio. And we're
Sorry
doing
about
this called for people to watch the video on YouTube. You can head over to Brian Keane Fitness, watch the video on YouTube because we're recording this in person as well.
Good. So go back to, let's say you have an individual with 4 children and a €4 million estate, let's say. And €1 million of that is agricultural, €1 million of that is business, €1 million of that is a house that one of the kids is still living in. That person, if they have a will at all, that will generally says, I leave everything to my wife, she leaves everything to me, and equally to our kids. Now, the problem with that is that now none of the kids will qualify for agricultural relief. None of the kids will qualify for business assets relief. None of the kids. And I say that to people. I go, why didn't my lawyer tell me? It's not his job. Mm. Your lawyer's job was to write down what you want. I told a story on my own podcast a long while ago from my own past. I had a friend of mine years ago who lost his wife. And his children, he had 3 young girls when he lost his wife. And about 10 years later, he met a new lady. And about 5 years after that, the new lady and him got married. And we're sitting in a tennis club having lunch after playing tennis. And he says to me, I was with my solicitor yesterday. I told him to change my will. I've left everything to the new wife and instructed her to leave it, whatever's left, to my kids. And I said, if you excuse the vernacular, because this is a quote, you gobshite. And he said, what? And I said, you've just put, and at that time the allowance was $500,000. He'd 3 girls. You've just put 1.5 million of your assets into the tax net that were outside, because the girls aren't related to the new wife. And he went, why didn't my lawyer tell me? Not his job. His job was to write down what you wanted and to put it on a piece of paper, and you signed it. And he went, oh, Jesus, what do I do? As well, there are two. I mean, generally speaking, there's solutions to problems. And I said, there are two solutions. Either the new wife adopts the girls and becomes their legal mother, so they're not strangers in law anymore, and you leave the will the way it is. Or you leave a lifetime interest to the new wife in all the assets, but you leave the assets to the girls. So that when the new wife shuffles off, and she was considerably younger than him, so the odds were she'll shuffle off second, if you know what I mean. That it's seen that the girls are inheriting from their father, not from a stranger. So hopefully that gives you a kind of broad idea of that, anybody can quote the law at you. But quoting the law, I mean, take for example, you come to me and you say, I have a pain in my heart. Well, I can Google what a pain in the heart, and I can tell you, well, it's likely this or it's likely that. But, I shouldn't be prescribing to you because I don't have the medical training to do so. So it's one thing to be able to recite the rules. It's another thing to be able to interpret and use those rules for your best possible advantage as the patient or as the client. And that's what a good financial planner does. Anybody can look up the rules, but how does it apply? So going back to my friend on the consult, you leave the farm to this kid, you leave the business to this kid, you leave the house to this kid. And what would have been, in that case, about a 1.2 million tax liability turned into a zero tax liability.
It's reminding me of a story from the book, and it's escaping me right now because I think it was an engineer that was questioning, okay, why do I need a financial planner? And I think it was an engineer that you were like, well, look, if I look at these designs, and he's like, you're not going to be able to interpret it.
Architect.
Architect, yes. Can you tell that? Just because I think this is an important aha moment for people, because as you said, they will start Googling what you've said. They'll listen to a podcast. They might read the book and then start Googling it. But it's the same as me as a business coach or a nutritionist or a fitness coach. It's not about here, Google, this is what you follow. It's the interpretation and applying it to your context, your situation, your life. Can you tell that story just for people?
Well, this was back when I was recruiting new clients as a financial planner, which I don't do anymore, as you know. But I was in an architect's office, and I kind of talked him into meeting me. He didn't really want to meet me, but I was persistent. And we're standing in his office, and there's this, standing desk, where he's drawing some plan for some building or something. And he says, "Why do I need you?" And I pointed at the plan in front of him. I said, "Can I tell you what I see here?" And he said, "Well, okay, tell me." And I see a pretty drawing. I see a bunch of numbers that I don't know what they mean, And broadly, I see a house. And I said, "Now, can you tell me what you see?" And he says, "Well, I see angles and I see load bearing and I said, "Why do you see something different to me?" And he said, "Because I'm a trained architect." I said, "So, okay, I accept that. Is it possible that when I look at a pension fund, is it possible that when I look at a loan note, when it's possible that I see something different to you?" And he went, I see it now. So that's the thing. Anybody can read the paper, but to understand what it really means, to understand how it impacts on you, in his case, to understand how it impacts on his client, that the bloody roof won't fall in when there's 2 foot of snow on it, or whatever it might be. I couldn't understand. I could look at that drawing for a month and I wouldn't see any of that. But he could see it in an instant. And that's the argument I have for what I see when I look at a pension fund. I can see in an instant what you, with no disrespect to you, won't see in a month.
Or a year.
No, never. I would never see, unless I went back to college and became an architect. Then I could look at it. But until I do that, I might as well be looking in a bush, as in terms of the architect's plans. And when he looks at his pension or his life insurance or his income protection or critical illness or whatever it might be, his mortgages, he might as well be looking in a bush.
I think it's so important that that was one of my favorite stories that sunk in directly from the book, because one, obviously I'm biased in terms of I work with people on business and you're seeing things from a different angle, different perspective, and we become too close to our own things, or we just don't have the knowledge in the case of finances and money. And that's why having someone that people can like, know and trust like you, as I said, you're my go-to person with this because I am your audience. I've consumed all the podcasts, the book, the course, I'll be the consult. And for those that are struggling with it, I think showing them where to go and where to follow up. And I'm going to link the podcast in the show notes. I'm going to link the book. I'm going to link the course, and I'll link the social media channels, the Instagram, TikTok.
Brilliant.
There's so much stuff there for people. And we're going to go a little bit deeper in a moment, Paul. That's going to be a private conversation just for the circle members and the group coaching that I work with in terms of businesses, because the questions will be different because it's people who are running their own companies or early on in an entrepreneurial journey. So that's going to be specific. That'll be linked in the description for people that want to check that out as well. But I want to ask one final question, if that's okay. And that's, why should we write a will? I know this, having listened to the podcasts you've consumed on this or created on this that I've consumed on this. And there's that fear of death for people. It's very funny. I grew up in a household where my father's big on finances, is big on pushing a will for the reasons we spoke about. My mum, amazing in other areas, but is a little bit of a, that's fine. It's okay. Won't push that side. So people fall on different sides of the spectrum, really, in terms of afraid to do it, as you said, superstition, or a lack of awareness on why they should do it. Talk to us a little bit and we'll wrap up on why everyone that's listening, or 90% of those that are listening, should be considering, or off the back of this, writing a will.
Everybody should have a will. Anybody who has any asset should have a will. Why? Because if you don't have a will, the state decides what happens to your money. That's the broad reason. And this doesn't mean that, the state gives it to a perfect stranger. Let's put it that way. People out there will think, well, even if I don't make a will, sure, the kids will get it, or my wife will get it, or my husband will get it, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of partially true. So let's talk about, a kind of relatively simple 2 parents, 2 children family. And let's say we're going to kill off the father in this case, because they're, we are the weaker sex, by the way. The women live longer than us, have less problems than us, in terms of medical problems. So let's kill off the father, and he hasn't had a will. So what happens? Well, what happens is the courts eventually, when they get around to it, will give 2/3 of all assets to the wife and 1/3 of all assets to the kids. So the problem there is that the wife is now in partnership with her children. They own part of the house, they own part of the dad's pension fund, they own part of whatever dad's name was on in this example. And that not necessarily what dad wanted. And the other problem there is, once those children, if they are already 18 or reach 18, they can demand the money. And there's nothing mum can do. Mum has to give them the money. So, most of us who have children don't want 18-year-olds with lots of money necessarily, because, and I can only use myself, at 18, I was a dummy, in relative terms. So a will, in that example, does away with that. So a will that says, I leave everything, that's in this family's example, the husband leaves everything to the wife leaves everything to the husband, and equally to the children if they're both dead. That does away with this 2/3, 1/3 split. And it does away with young children getting their hands on lots of money when maybe they're not capable of managing that money to their best possible advantage. The second, so that's the first benefit of making a will in that example. The second benefit is, I said, when the courts get around to it, because if you die intestate without a will, all assets in the deceased's name are frozen until the courts issue what are called letters of administration. Now, today the courts are closed. They don't open again till October. So if you're a person dealing with that today, you don't get to apply till October for letters of administration. And you may not get that application ratified or pushed through until December or January. So you have 5 to 6 months where your joint bank accounts are frozen, where any asset that held by the deceased are frozen. You can do nothing. So that's the second reason to have a will. Avoid the 2/3, 1/3 split that the state, the law of the land dictates it without a will, and to avoid the freezing. So if there's a will that says, I leave everything to you, you leave everything to me, well, all we have to do is produce a death cert, and a death cert is issued within hours of a person shuffling off this mortal coil. So they're the reasons, for standard reasons, to have a will. The other reason, of course, is the one we spoke of a minute ago, which is give the farm to that kid, give the house to that kid, that's part of the succession and inheritance tax minimisation. But in pure terms, no matter what wealth or not you have, a will is absolutely mandatory. And as I told you, 27% of Irish adults have a will according to the Law Society. And that needs to change.
If there's a will, there's a way to save on tax.
There is.
That is
There is. And certainly there's a way of, avoiding familial problems.
Brilliant way to wrap. Paul, as I mentioned in the introduction, I've consumed everything I think that you've created online, which is one of the rare times. Generally in a podcast, I'll do a lot of research on the front end. I've been consuming your stuff weekly and daily, sometimes on social media for the past year. So I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. Your podcast in particular, I was also on that. I will link that in the description for people. Excellent. They can hear more about my story on that in terms of the wealth accumulation, business setup, etc. But it's just a fountain of information. And then there's the book, the course, the consults, all going to be linked for people in the description below. Paul, keep doing what you're doing, and thank you so much again.
Thank you very much.